The beam hit the door again. For the third time that night, the lighthouse lantern swept across the black water, and for one impossible second, the oak door reflected the light back at me. Then darkness swallowed it again. I gripped the railing outside the lantern room so tightly my knuckles turned white. The tide had already come in. The rock where the door had been standing was now more than 20 feet underwater. There shouldn't have been anything left to see. Yet every time the light completed another rotation, the door was still there, standing beneath the ocean, perfectly upright, waiting. This is Tales of the Dark. A subscriber who spent years working along the Atlantic coast shared this experience with me. Some names and locations have been changed, but the events are told exactly as they remembered them. People imagine lighthouse keepers spend their nights watching ships. That's only part of the job. Most of your time is spent listening to the wind forcing itself through ancient stone. Listening to waves slamming against cliffs hard enough to shake the building. Listening to old floorboards settle beneath your boots when you're the only person for 50 miles. After enough years, you learn every sound, which is why the knocking terrified me. I'd been the keeper of Black Alder Lighthouse for nearly 18 years. It stood on a jagged rock almost 4 miles from the mainland. No tourists, no nearby islands, just the lighthouse, a weather station, a storage shed, and me. Supply boats visited every 2 weeks if the sea allowed it. Sometimes storms delayed them for days. I never minded. Solitude suited me. The lighthouse had become more familiar than my own home ever was. I knew every crack in the walls, every rusted hinge, every stair that creaked louder than the others. Nothing surprised me anymore, until the storm. The weather reports called it a rogue wave event. One wave far larger than anything surrounding it. Nobody expected it. Ships changed course. Fishing boats rushed into harbor. I watched from the lantern room as walls of black water crashed against the cliffs below. The entire lighthouse trembled. Windows rattled. Salt spray reached halfway up the tower. Then, almost as quickly as it began, the sea calmed. The following morning, I climbed down to inspect the damage. Pieces of driftwood covered the rocks. Fishing nets had wrapped themselves around the lower railing. One of the storage doors had been ripped clean off its hinges. Then I noticed something farther out. At first, I thought it was another piece of wreckage, a section of an old ship perhaps, but the shape was too symmetrical, too clean. The tide was unusually low, lower than I'd ever seen. I walked carefully across the exposed rocks until I reached a shallow tide pool. That's where I found it, an oak door standing perfectly upright, attached to nothing, no frame, no wall, no foundation beneath it, just a heavy wooden door balanced in the middle of a pool no deeper than my ankles. The ocean stretched endlessly behind it. I circled it twice. There were no support beams hidden beneath the water, no ropes, nothing holding it upright. It should have fallen over with the slightest touch. Instead, it felt as solid as stone. The wood looked old, centuries old. Dark oak covered with intricate carvings worn smooth by time. A tarnished brass handle sat on one side. There wasn't a single trace of rust. That made no sense. Anything left in seawater would have corroded years ago. I reached toward the handle, then stopped. Something about the silence felt wrong. The waves hadn't disappeared. I could still hear them crashing farther out, but around the door, everything had gone quiet. No gulls, no wind. Even the water inside the tide pool remained perfectly still. I stepped back, returned to the lighthouse, and told myself someone from the Coast Guard would deal with it. By sunset, the tide had swallowed the rocks again. The door vanished beneath the ocean. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, until that night. Exactly 3:17, knock, knock, knock. 3 slow knocks echoed through the lighthouse. Not loud, not violent, almost polite. I looked toward the entrance. Nothing. I searched every room, storage, generator room, kitchen, nothing. The knocking stopped. The following morning, the tide receded. The door was back, standing exactly where I'd left it. Dry. Not damp, not covered in seaweed. Dry as though it had never spent the night beneath the Atlantic Ocean. This time I brought my camera. I took nearly 20 photographs, different angles, close-ups, wide shots. Satisfied, I climbed back inside when I reviewed the pictures. Every image showed empty water. The tide pool, the rocks, the sea, no door. I thought the camera had malfunctioned, so I went back outside. The door was still standing there. I looked through the camera's viewfinder. Nothing. Lowered it. The door returned. Raised it again. Gone. A chill spread through my chest. I wasn't photographing an object. I was looking at something the camera couldn't see. That evening I radioed the mainland. My supervisor laughed. Too much time alone. I know what I saw. I'm sure you do. He promised to send someone during the next supply run. 5 days later, weather permitting, that night, 3:17, knock, knock, knock. This time, I knew where it came from, not the front door, not the walls. Outside, I climbed the tower. The lantern completed another slow rotation. The beam crossed the ocean. There, the oak door, standing beneath 15 feet of seawater, someone, or something, was knocking from the other side. Each time the light swept across it, 3 knocks perfectly synchronized. As though whoever stood behind it knew exactly when the beam would return. The next morning I found footprints, not mine, bare feet, leading from the tide pool toward the lighthouse. The prints were filled with seawater. They stopped at the front steps. There were none leading away. I searched every room, every closet, every maintenance passage. I was alone, yet wet footprints appeared again the following morning, and the morning after that, always ending at the front door, never continuing inside. On the 7th night the storm returned, not as violent as before, but enough to shake the windows. Power flickered. The backup generator coughed to life, then failed for the first time in years. Black Alder Lighthouse went dark, only for a few seconds, but in those few seconds, I heard footsteps climbing the spiral staircase, slow, heavy. One step, then another. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it down the stairwell. Nothing. The footsteps continued, closer. They should have been visible by now. The beam reached the landing, empty. Another step, directly below me. I backed away until I reached the lantern room. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then 3 gentle knocks, not downstairs, not outside, on the trapdoor leading into the lantern room. Something had climbed the lighthouse, and it was standing directly beneath me, waiting for me to open the door. The knocking came again. 3 slow knocks, not loud, not desperate. Patient, like someone who knew I couldn't ignore them forever. I stood frozen beside the lantern. The trapdoor was barely 6 feet away. The old oak hatch separated me from whatever had climbed nearly 100 feet of spiral stairs without making a single sound until now. Then, a voice, my voice, opened the door. Every hair on my arm stood up. It wasn't similar to my voice. It was identical, the same tone, the same breathing, the same slight rasp I'd developed after years of breathing salt air. I didn't answer. The voice spoke again. You've been alone long enough. 3 more knocks. I grabbed the emergency flare gun hanging beside the lantern controls and backed against the window. Another minute passed. Nothing. When the sun finally rose, I waited another hour before forcing myself to lift the trapdoor. The staircase was empty. No footprints, no seawater, nothing, but halfway down the spiral stairs, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The wall. Someone had carved a sentence into the stone. The carving looked old, older than the lighthouse itself. It read, "Do not let it inside." The letters hadn't been there the day before. I would have noticed. For the rest of that morning, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. By noon, the tide had retreated again. The door was back, exactly where it always stood, only this time, it was open. I knew it had been closed before. I would have remembered. Now it stood slightly ajar, just enough to reveal darkness beyond it. Not the ocean, darkness. I walked closer. The tide pool should have reflected sunlight through the opening. Instead, it swallowed the light completely. I stopped only a few feet away. There was no sound, no wind, no waves, nothing. Finally, I reached out and pushed the door open. It moved silently. Beyond it was a hallway. A narrow stone corridor lit by old oil lamps. I recognized it instantly. It was my lighthouse, or at least, It looked like my lighthouse, the same spiral staircase, the same stone walls, the same framed weather maps. Everything was reversed. The staircase curved in the opposite direction. The windows were on the wrong side. Even the lantern room above seemed slightly lower than it should have been. I should have turned around instead. I stepped through. The air changed immediately. It smelled older, dustier, like a building that hadn't been opened in decades. I called out, no answer. The hallway stretched toward the staircase. On a small wooden table sat a familiar object, my coffee mug. The crack on the handle was identical, so was the faded blue paint. I picked it up. The coffee inside was still warm. Someone had made it only minutes earlier. I slowly climbed the stairs. Everything looked almost right. Almost. My boots were beside the bed, only they were cleaner. The blankets were folded differently. The clock on the wall ticked backward, not quickly, just backward, tick, 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 every second moving away instead of forward. Then I noticed the journal, my journal. I opened it. The handwriting was mine. Every entry matched my own. Until yesterday, my journal ended with, "The door appeared after the storm." This one continued. It described hearing the knocks, finding the footprints, seeing the hallway, everything I'd experienced. Page after page, exactly. Then I reached today's entry. It had already been written. I hadn't written it. It read, "He crossed the threshold today." My hands began shaking. The next line froze me. "He still believes he can return." Footsteps echoed upstairs, slow, measured. I closed the journal. Someone was in the lantern room. I hurried upward. The room was empty. The lantern rotated peacefully beyond the glass. I could see the ocean, except there was no lighthouse beneath me, only open water. The tower stood alone in the sea. Impossible, no island, no rocks, nothing supporting it. Then I looked down, far below. Another lighthouse stood on the real island. Mine, smoke drifted from its chimney. Someone was inside, someone wearing my coat. The figure stepped onto the balcony. He looked up at me. Even from that distance, I knew the face. It was mine. He raised one hand, not waving, warning me. Then he slowly closed the lantern shutters. The beam stopped turning. Darkness swallowed the sea. A hand touched my shoulder. I spun around, no one. But the journal was now lying open on the floor. A new sentence had appeared. "You stayed too long." The oil lamps throughout the hallway went out together, one after another, until only darkness remained. Then, 3 knocks behind me. I ran down the staircase. Through the hallway toward the ocean door. It was still open. I threw myself through it. The cold Atlantic air hit my face. I collapsed into the tide pool behind me. The door slammed shut. I didn't look back. I ran all the way to the lighthouse. Locked every door, closed every shutter. That night, 3:17, no knocking. I almost believed it was over. Then I climbed into bed. Something felt wrong. The room smelled different. The blankets were folded too neatly. The clock was ticking backward. I rushed downstairs. The kitchen table was on the opposite wall. The staircase curved the wrong way. The windows faced east instead of west. I wasn't back. I'd brought the wrong lighthouse with me. Panic took over. I searched every room, every cabinet, every storage closet. Everything belonged to me, every photograph. Every tool, every piece of clothing. Yet tiny details were wrong. A spoon drawer where the plates should be. Books I'd never bought. Letters I'd never received. Then I found another journal. It wasn't hidden. It was waiting on my desk. The final page had today's date. It read, "He finally came home. For the first time in 18 years, the radio crackled to life. Black Alder Lighthouse, this is Coast Guard Patrol 7. Respond." I grabbed the microphone. "This is Black Alder, thank God." A pause followed. Then the operator asked, "Identify yourself." "I'm the lighthouse keeper." Another pause. "We already have a lighthouse keeper." "What?" "Our supply boat reached Black Alder this morning." Keeper reported everything operational. I couldn't breathe. "Who did you speak to?" "The man who's been stationed there for 18 years. "I've been stationed here for 18 years. Silence. Then, very quietly, the operator asked, "If you're the keeper, then who just answered your lighthouse radio?" The transmission cut into static. I never heard another voice. The next supply boat found the lighthouse exactly as it had always been. The beacon was working. The kitchen was clean, the logs were complete. The keeper greeted them at the dock. He signed their paperwork, shared coffee with the crew, even joked about the weather. No one suspected anything was wrong because to everyone else, he looked exactly like me. Sometimes when storms drive the tide farther out than anyone has ever seen, sailors still report an old oak door standing alone in the ocean beneath Black Alder Lighthouse. Most dismiss it as fog or exhaustion. A few claim they heard knocking coming from somewhere beneath the waves, 3 slow knocks, always at exactly 3:17 in the morning if they're lucky. The tide comes back before curiosity wins. If you are brave enough to hear more nightmares, subscribe to Tales of the Dark, and if you have your own terrifying experience, leave it in the comments or send your story by email. Maybe your nightmare will become the next story told here.